Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me on this session today at the Serverless Architecture Conference. We are talking about, or I will talk about, a startup way of integrating serverless framework. So I have this typical icebreaker question: who used serverless framework in production so far? Okay, that is good. It's not too many, because I will also give quite a one-on-one on how to use serverless framework in the second part. So I think that fits quite hopefully quite well to the audience. So why I put startup-like way in the beginning is that we thought about serverless in general, and the whole ecosystem is quite huge. So there's a 3-day conference about it. There must be something that people are interested in. But I want to focus in how to bring this kind of technology to a very young company with a varying kind of skill set among the developers, or even like the limited resource developers, and still using this great or very potential technology. So let me give you some brief facts on who's standing in front of you. We are Laserhub. I give you a quick example of what we are doing. So we are a startup that is building sheet metal parts. If we would be a B2C company, we would build bottle openers. This is not our business. We are completely B2B, serving industrial customers with individual sheet metal parts. So we are a typical platform that has no assets, no production. We are simply the digital interface for purchasing sheet metal parts. If you want to talk about the business model, approach me afterwards. This is not going to be the talk. We were founded in 2017, are now 29 people, have roughly about 2,000 customers, and we process so far 200,000 of these individual parts. So they are all cut drawings, cut models, and that results in 1,400,000 kilo of actual sheet metal. I brought some of them. If you want a bottle opener, you can grab one after the talk. My name is Jonas. I'm CTO there. I have 6 years of experience as a software developer in a varying tech stack, now in JavaScript. And I spent some time in consulting for digital business models for medium-sized and large corporates. So this combination of the business model perspective and technology drives me personally and actually every day. And some characteristics about myself: I have a young daughter that is actually the same age as Laserhub, I love hip hop, windsurfing, and soccer. Cool. So as CTO, I try to follow some kind of principles, and when we make new experiments, I call them, or we introduce new technologies, because we developers tend to explore and love to integrate new technologies every day, because that is actually what drives our passion, or for most of us. But integrating a new technology every week is quite big of a risk, I would say. So what are my principles, or what I try to have is like each technology we use and each use case we try to adopt is that we have direct value for customers, suppliers, our internal developers. I don't want to have too much distraction from our normal process in terms of developing deployments, etc. And I hate things built for the trash bin. So hopefully we will use that stuff in production. And the main part of that project, if you call it, was that I want to have people really learn how to adopt new technologies and really get into this mood of, okay, there's something that looks great. How can we use it? How can we learn from it quite fast? And making this a habit. So really exploring new kind of technologies. We are a rapidly growing startup, so scale is an issue. We are a B2B, so it's not like completely crazy scale in terms of performance or resources. But in the end, everything that we want to introduce should have that thing in mind, that we might be able to scale this heavily. So I chose a task that was interesting coming in at some point. So we are connected to, integrated with several third-party SaaS tools like a CRM, and for our system, very relevant is our shipping services to book and track shipments, because we're also taking care of the logistics. And we we were approached somehow by business that, hey, we need updates from these kind of SaaS tools, and then WebHooks come into play as a natural solution. Now, the funny thing about WebHooks is that the provider is actually making decisions about authorization or authentication, and we have the typical challenge of availability and what to do if the service that actually responds to that webhook is not available. So I think it was came up as a funny idea of, okay, how do we approach that? And a natural. I wanted to first talk about challenges. So, what was the situation back then when we had this task? So technically, we were a bootstrap platform. I think it was about a year ago. So the platform was roughly 1 or 1.5 years old. Single repository, a typical Node.js, Express.js, REST stack, and I would call it imperfect architecture. It was quite fine to maintain, but not everything is perfect. We had a single authentication strategy, never thought about this, that we need more. We deployed to Heroku at this time, which was very convenient to deploy a Node.js app to Heroku. Then this task came up, and I always have this daunting risk of building something that is a monolith in the end, right? So this drives me every day, and try to understand how can we go in a direction that avoids having this non-breakable monolith. I'm not this fan of saying monoliths are bad. It's just like you have to have that on the list and on the page, and that was something that drove me for this task. As I said, full stack developers, varying skill sets. At this point in time, it was me and one internal, I think one external developer. We are now about 6 to 8 developers working on the platform. So a growing team that usually does not know everything about everything, so you have to balance. So what do you want to bring into the company? What is our next evolvement of technology stack and things we use? We don't have DevOps. We are looking for someone. If you know someone, let me know. And overall, we haven't spent a lot of time in serverless, API gateway, sophisticated authentication, etc. So how do you bring such a technology then to your company? How do you make sure to do that? A naive implementation or like a straightforward implementation would be, well, just do another endpoints into your application, think about authentication a little bit, or just ignore it, and run the logic behind that in your Node.js application. This would have been definitely the fastest thing to do, but I feared a little bit that all these things will creep into the platform, like different authentication strategies and very, very specific logic, although it's quite small, that is just bound to these kind of external services that we want to integrate. And I had a coffee chat or a beer chat with befriended CTO, and he explained me something about serverless. So I was also a little bit hooked by the idea of using the technology, to be honest. So we came up with like, okay, what happens next if we build this? Again, what happens about authentication? What if you want to split our repository, our app? So the best example to do is this shipment kind of service. It's very relevant for our business. It's completely within our app currently, but it feels just like the next step to move that outside of our current application to another application service or whatever. But I was a bit hesitant just to say, okay, now we build a shipment server or shipment microservice. That was not the thing I had in mind. I want to have a smaller scope for the technology, smaller scope for the project. But this is a potential upside that we have in the future. What happens is our server is down, then we have to think about, okay, retry strategies, etc. Then this topic of learning serverless, and then scalability and version, but that's mainly like you bring these things up that you have good reasoning, but the last two are not highlighted because we didn't really want to focus on that in the beginning. Although this is one of the great things that serverless, and as we use it with Lambda, actually brings with it. So let me explain the idea that we had, that we came up for how to bring serverless to our company. So the basic setup was that we had these 3 different SaaS tools that wanted to give us information using webhooks. And we decided to build something like that, which is a simple API gateway HTTP endpoint that triggers a Lambda function, and then this Lambda function pushes information to a queue, and our app simply runs on that queue and runs some operations on the queue. If we need more information, again, back from the SaaS tool, we do it not by the post, but by GET request and going back to the tool. And this rectangle is then served by Serverless Framework. And I will explain in a minute how actually this is done as a little one-on-one, as I explained. So why did we do it like this, right? So especially why is this Lambda is basically, as we will see, just a forwarder of that message and of that request, of that webhook request, and pushing it to a queue. Why did we do that? It's basically keeping everything small, a small scope, still value, deploy it, have it in production, and then understand if things are working well. That was the main idea of this very, very limited and small use case. And for us, it was a success, as I will explain later on, as we were live quite soon, and this is running since then. So in my opinion, or in our opinion, the benefits are that if there is auth coming up, we can use API Gateway, because API Gateway offers a lot of authentication strategy out of the box. Again, fun fact, this is like the theoretical part. In practice, all of the 3 authentication models that we had to use were not covered by these out-of-the-box authentication strategies, but still they were in the Lambda, so not bound to our own application. Yeah, the messages were like intriguing to say, okay, messages is a pattern and an integration form that can be used in every kind of matter, and as webhooks are usually like trigger things that are not directly need a response, so it's usually quite well served with an async kind of pattern, and you can use them later on if you move out the app somewhere else. And then this kind of retry strategy is basically built in message queues. So I think you will never come to a situation where that this is the bottleneck, mainly here. So having this quite safely, the messages are there, we are happy, and that's it. And the SaaS tool doesn't have to care about it. Yeah, and then the learning aspect. So mainly how to do serverless compared to a different kind of application or a normal application, so to say, a cloud-based application that we had so far. And scalability, I think, is not an issue. So the decision for Serverless Framework was made easily, so we usually do not want to spend time heavily in researching and making 10 proof of concepts just to identify the best framework. And overall, it feels like, yeah, it is worth a try and stable enough and ready enough to be used in production. So I will quickly go through 4 or 5 steps that we identified as the major things you have to do to completely set up the thing I showed you on the diagram in an AWS environment. That's also funny. I can use a down button here, but there is no down button. Okay, so Serverless Framework is basically a CLI that runs your infrastructure or helps you to run your infrastructure as code. 2 things you have to do. You need an we need an AWS account, so maybe that's something to worth mentioning. Serverless is completely cloud agnostic, with limitations on a specific feature of each cloud, which I'll also come to in a second. But from a general perspective, you can use serverless to run your application in any kind of cloud. For us, it was AWS just because we were already there and just because we used AWS Activate, which is a great program for startups to lock you into AWS. Anyway, so you have your credentials ready and you follow the tutorial on Serverless Framework docs and you push serverless deploy. And it's really that easy. So as soon as you have the CLI set up using your credentials, it gives you, I think it's an init on the project, so it gives you some kind of boilerplate project, and it really spins up a mini application for you within the cloud without you know anything about API gateway, lambdas in specific, how to connect the dots. And I'm not sure how many of you already spent some time in AWS Management Console. It is not that easy if it gets a bit more complex. So this is completely abstracted by Serverless Framework, and it's really enjoyable. Like as a developer, it's really nice to use it. Even I could imagine in the future if you get really into the DevOps realm or like you spend a bit more time on it, you have more abilities to also test around stuff using these kind of things in the cloud. So there are two main things that Serverless Framework works on. The first thing is the serverless YAML, which is the configuration of your infrastructure. And the second part is the application, which is in this example just the handler.js. And this is actually what you get after this Hello World example. So let me quickly go through. So we have a set of functions defined, and functions already indicate that in the AWS world, these are our lambdas. They have a name, and here is the code, the handler, that should be executed within that lambda function. And this references some kind of application. Actually, somehow, like not completely, but you can run complete applications with that kind of setup. So we use really basic functions, and as the name indicates, it is, I think, started with the idea of running small functions, but there is a application limit, I think, of 50 megabyte or something. Can't remember completely. So you can run complex applications within a Lambda function, taking into account the limits of Lambda. And then you need something. Well, you spin up something somewhere, and then there's application code sitting and waiting for a trigger. And then again, you can identify, or you can configure different kinds of events, how to trigger that Lambda. And in our case, it's an HTTP event. You can use message-based event, trigger events from CloudWatch, and there's several ones. And the good thing is, again, if you use the Hello World or the boilerplate, at that point, you get, 10 examples for all the configurations. We will fill that kind of function in a minute. This is JavaScript code, so you can use different kind of runtimes if you want. It is easy now because this is our real-world example. Usually I hate these Hello World and Greenfield examples because they hide some kind of complexity. So I will try to do to get at least 2 or 3 barriers that we came up with and how we approach them to give you a bit more of a detail than not just the Hello World example. But it was actually our case, so we started Greenfield. So that was it. Yeah, so if you do that, you have the API gateway, then the Lambda and the CloudWatch as a default logging mechanism. I would advise every developer making this shift back and forth between the CLI and the management console in the beginning, because you see actually what's happening, and you see also how stages are being done. So you always get stages out of the box for dev, staging, prod, or whatever you like. So you basically have this kind of setup for every kind of stage. And I think, in my opinion, for a learning perspective and to really understand what's happening, looking into the management console and see the visual representation makes a lot of sense for each developer. And then you can write JavaScript code, which is, in our case, we simply used an auth function I will not talk about in more detail, basically token-based. One is different for every kind of SaaS tool that we integrated. And then we wanted to push something to a queue. We used SQS. So the handling that in code is easy by using AWS SDK. But the biggest question is, well, if you push to a queue, then there must be a queue, and you must have access to that queue. How do you do that? So this is just it. Right? This is the function, and there's no other kind of code that gives you access to that queue. So that's where resources and permissions come into play. So you have the chance, again, in the serverless YAML, which represents your main infrastructure. For example, you add IAM role statements. And I talked before that it's serverless supposed to be cloud agnostic. It comes to a limit when it wants to use specific individual cloud features, which is, for example, IAM in the AWS world. So in this case, we allow our function to have access to a specific resource. And this resource is supposed to be different for every kind of stage. And to maintain that, you have the ability to define an environment and then have a separate file, because you don't want to store any kind of secure credentials within your repository. So you choose to extract these kind of key value pairs to a separate function that sits locally in our case. And if you deploy, then the Serverless Framework takes these kind of environment variables and spins up your infrastructure as needed. In this case, with access to a specific queue provided using an IAM role. Yeah, so this is the typical don't do the newbie stuff. Don't forget if the boilerplate is there, you have on the root or on the hello URL, you have access to your Lambda. Don't forget to redirect it, because it exploits at least some information on your application. And gives you a bit of a glance on how to handle things within Lambda. So in this case, this works with a callback. So also the SDK and Lambdas are not yet completely in the ES6 world, probably, but it's quite easy to do a redirect. So it's basically you get an application or an environment where you run every kind of application in some kind of web framework behind some trigger. And this is completely decoupled. So running this function using a different trigger, run it regularly, using a CloudWatch trigger, whatever, it doesn't matter. So it's still there, it's a function, and you can trigger it whatever you want. And configure it is completely stable using infrastructure as code, using Serverless Framework. One part that I'm still open to discuss, I would say, is the last point. So it's developer experience. So cool, it's great. You just spawn up your first Lambda. You're completely excited to get this new technology running. You have your endpoint. You even maybe configured your custom domain for it. And then you want to extend it. And then what do? You change the code. Okay, you run deploy. If you have a small application, this is really fast. You can even deploy several specific functions. So let's say you have a big application, 10, 20 functions within that. If you hit the deploy, it completely spins up everything and replaces the complete stack with all the functions, but you can run it individually for each function that you're currently working on, which makes the deploy extremely fast. But still, it's not a developer experience that you want. You want to run it locally, and maybe even to react to constant changes, debugging, etc. Serverless, SLS is just a shortcut for that, is offering a plugin. So you run servers offline, and it creates an environment that actually behaves like your AWS cloud. But it's not 100% the same. So we face one or two things where the offline environment behaved a bit different. So be aware that this is the case. for me personally, it's still amazing what you do there. With the click of a button, you spin up 10 resources in a cloud somewhere. I'm still amazed by that. But you can imagine how complex it is to set it up locally. So have that in mind. If you use SLS offline, there are differences between the cloud application and your offline experience, so to say. So, our main learning was after 2 weeks, so I post 4 weeks because you need a little bit of time running it. After 2 weeks we were live. It was done by a working student in 2 weeks, part-time, who has never had big experience with serverless. And that gave me at least an impression, okay, we started completely from the ground. It worked. It gave us enough tools and features to build what we wanted, and it's still running. So, it was a great experience. As I said, Serverless Framework, we like it as a tool for developers. It needs its plugins, so it's typical. We have a core, some kind of extensions, a lot of extensions. So you need to check every time you have a specific feature, you want to do something. Okay, how is this done? I like the API staging environments that you really get out of the box and that work smoothly. The visual representation I talked about, I find it really handy. And for me, it felt like it's easier to approach an AWS infrastructure as code. So it's more natural to look into serverless documentation, to identify how to do this, and you read code or configurations and not clicking around with the mouse. And then you have all the benefits of it. I don't have to talk about, I think, today. But just approaching this kind of thing using Serverless Framework was really good. And overall, this is not the 4 weeks, but now after some months running it, everybody touched it. So we have this repository and we want to change something. Then the new SaaS platform came into play and a new developer was on it. And with 2 or 3 hours of briefing, people are capable of impacting or of contributing to that kind of code. And so for me as CTO, it was a great success to have everybody touch this technology. That doesn't mean that we are now fully serverless and everything is now in serverless and we go microservice serverless, because there are limitations and that's things that we are still identifying how to handle them. So you have a learning curve for each feature, like roles and permissions, domain plugins to run your custom domains using serverless. Every time you have a little of a learning curve, and you have to identify, okay, well, how to handle that in particular. So it's not like serverless and then everything is there. Roles and permissions management was a huge pain. So in the tutorial, what you need to do is grant administration access to AWS. As a startup, it's okay, but I think all of you will fear to do that for just some random developer, giving him the chance to deploy something. We are already on the way, having different kind of AWS accounts, running this in Terraform, but to find actually the permissions you need to deploy a serverless application, it's about 10 to 15 permissions you need. Maybe we should, now as we identified them, write something about it, because it was really a pain. We never found the corresponding permissions. Maybe they changed too often. I don't know. It took us probably 3 to 4 approaches to really understand, okay, now that is the minimum amount of permissions you need on an IAM user that is capable as a developer to deploy a serverless function. As I said, the offline environment and the Lambda limits that you have to acknowledge. I talked about the main package or application size. There's payload limits and some other limits on Lambda. So it's not the perfect world where you get everything for free. Yes, and as I said, my main question is, why waiting, and how can you do that quite like right now to go serverless? Because for me, it was a great experience to see it is possible to limit the scope of your project, use it in production without having this distraction to the main application. So we completely continued everything like before, and we had this really limited use case that helped us to understand everything from, okay, what's the learning curve? How do I bring it to production? And how does it feel running in production? And I would say it was a success as a project, and it's still running. I'm not saying, as before, I totally go crazy and naive about, okay, now that is the thing we go for. Yeah, and if you want to read a bit more about it, this is the article that is basically rephrasing what I said today. And if you want to contact me, I'm happy to get your requests, some more details. That is for me. Don't forget to grab a bottle opener. And thank you very much. If you have questions, happy to answer them.